Jim, thanks, and thanks for making us feel so welcome, and thanks for everyone for spending some time with us today. Looking forward to the presentation. Um, yeah, I think just as a primer, and as I move to the sort of agenda slide, uh, one of the main problems we're looking to solve, guys, and this is going to be the first part of the presentations around the state of AppSec and sort of some of the things that are out there, is our mission, sort of that we took on, close to a year ago now, as we started to develop this solution, and some of the problems we were trying to solve were, how do we help security, compliance, enforcement, all of that stuff keep pace with the speed and velocity of things that are going on today in terms of software deployment. And so, we'll talk a little bit about that to start in terms of that state of AppSec. Then I'll give you guys, sort of an overview of what secure software delivery is and sort of how we're going about solving some of those problems, right? Helping our customers solve some of those issues. And then to prove to you that we have actual software, I'll be doing a demonstration to sort of walk you through it. And then we can take questions from there. I'm joined today by Gopi Rabala. He's our CTO, and the guy that's here to make sure that I color within the lines as I talk about sort of these things. And we'll go from there. Um, Real quick, a little bit about us. OpsMX is, and our tagline from sort of the inception of the company has been ship better software faster. So we've always been fascinated with this concept of how we can help our customers ship software, add automation to that shipping of software to get it to go faster, right? I mean, ever since this concept of continuous delivery and GitOps, and this idea of how do we get the ideas from the brains or the whiteboards that our engineers are using through their keyboards and out to actually adding value to our customers as fast as possible. That's been, the mission of, both Gopi and Gopal, our co-founders. And I think, adding a security layer to this as we look to help you automate the security, compliance, and enforcement process was a natural extension for us. And obviously, you can see we're working with some of the larger organizations, in terms of helping them accomplish some of these goals. So that's just, again, a little bit about sort of who we are, and sort of what we set out to do. Now, as we move into the meat of today's presentation, OpsMX Delivery Shield is sort of what we've put together, right? And I think when we think about AppSec today, and we spent a lot of time talking to people before a single keystroke fell on developing this application. But one of the things, some of the things we heard were too many tools, right? Like a lot of like, and I think the idea behind this is it's not that there's too much overlap there. It's if you're taking the best of breed approach to implementing things like static code analysis or pen testing or other scanning tools, and if you're scanning pre-build, post-build, and then sort of scanning running images, these things, there's all different sort of tooling that you can use and all different pieces that sort of fit together. However, the data that they produce can be very disjointed, right? There's no unified view of these things. A lot of times it's hard to sort of understand sort of where data is coming from, or where do I go to get X, Y, or Z in the event of, let's say, an audit, right? So again, I think most of the tools that people are using, and one of the slides I show from time to time is it's a periodic table of elements that has all the DevOps tools that are out there in the world, and it's an eye chart. And so I think the idea behind this is we wanted to make sure that we keep that ability to go with best of breed tooling. So whether or not you want to use commercial tools or open source alternatives that are out there, there's no reason to not start or make sure that you're leveraging some of these things to get a really good sort of security or supply chain security process going. However, there are some challenges, right? And then obviously, when we say shift left slows developers down, here's the thing. We agree with the concept, right? The sooner in the process you identify security problems, the more effective it is in terms of fixing those things. So you can be in fixing them, and it's more cost effective. It allows you to sort of deliver on time if you can sort of put some of these checks early into the process. And so I think, ultimately what we're trying to do is come along and say, as a company that produces software, we want you to continue to do all these things. We just want to lay on top and ultimately show you how to make them easier, or give you the tool or the dashboards that are going to help make it easier for you, or give you the enforcement layer that's going to make sure that nothing slips by, right? And so that way there, you have the ability to sort of step on the gas, increase the acceleration in terms of your deployments, knowing you've got the safety checks in place. So, in terms of what we can offer is, faster, more secure application releases. We can automate the compliance and enforcement process. And again, I think the piece there is being able to allow you to operate at a scale and velocity, that's going to meet the needs of your customer without having to worry about how am I going to piece together or make sure or play that game of whack-a-mole with one report, two report, three report to make sure that things are in line, and hopefully help you lower the overall cost of your AppSec program. So that's sort of some of the challenges that we discovered in some of the interviews that we did, some of the potential prospects and customers that we spoke to, and then ultimately to help illustrate some of those challenges, we look at sort of how the world's changed, right? So as everything has moved to cloud, SaaS offerings are sort of just a foregone conclusion. Most people expect their software vendors to have some form of SaaS offering. So we start to look at sort of the old world, which was more centralized teams, monolithic applications. You'd release, maybe a major release every quarter, but you do, sort of monthly patch releases. That was, sort of the way folks operated, right? And today, some people still do operate like this. But then there was this explosion, right, where people were like, hey, I want to make sure that bug fixes get out to my customers quickly. I want to make sure that as I develop these new features, that I'm generating value very, very quickly with my customers. And so, we started down the path of that sort of continuous delivery, which then turned into sort of GitOps, which now leads to not just, maybe 5 or 6 releases in some way, shape, or form a month, but, potentially 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 releases a day, depending on sort of how you've chosen to operate. And so I think that is, represents a new challenge when it comes to sort of operating in a secure manner. And it comes to making sure that, you've put up the appropriate guardrails, and you're operating within those guardrails as it relates to software releases and sort of what's acceptable. Because again, given my background as well as a SaaS operator, you layer on top of this the compliance piece, where now I've got to answer to an auditor, depending on sort of if what certifications I need to have, whether it be SOC 2, Type 2, ISO 27001, High Trust. They all come with, hey, sort of every year I want you to come out and visit you, and I want you to prove to me that the stuff that is in your SDLC, that you're living up to that. And so that can be challenging, again, at this velocity and at this scale. And then you layer in the tooling. This is what I'd mentioned earlier, right? So, you have to be able to integrate with and operate within the data collection boundaries of your tooling, right? So again, I think, rather than running around and sort of looking, and we've all been there, the night before an audit, someone go over to this system, that system, pull this report. let's make sure we have, we can talk through the last 10 deployments and sort of what their security posture was. It's really hard. And again, this goes back to some of the pillars that we were using, and some of the core principles we're using, and sort of building on a solution was, how do we help customers go down the path of being able to use the tools that they already have in place, and that, but ultimately make the job easier of making sure that we can monitor and audit and ultimately enforce rules and those sets of guardrails that we know those auditors or our customers. More importantly, I know I mention auditors a lot, but I think we have an obligation to our customer, right, to make sure that things are safe and secure, and that they're not going to wind up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for using our systems, right? So I think that's something that's important to all of the folks that we do business with. Now, some of the challenges that we hear, and it's interesting, when we start to get down to the tactical part of this, is as we were going through and having conversations with larger organizations, this concept of, or this phrase was coined, of sort of choose your own adventure, right? Where one of the compliance folks at a large company was telling us that one of his challenges here is that he's got app development teams that essentially are out choosing their own tools, and because we want to make those developers as productive as possible, they're allowed to do that. It's not really a problem. But you wind up with, sort of a cornucopia, if you will, of different processes and different data, and there's no normalization of any of that, right? That results in that sort of siloed visibility, right? So how do you get to a place where you have any kind of visibility into what's going on, outside of just asking them, like, hey, are things good? Well, yeah, we haven't been hacked yet. I mean, that's hardly comforting to people, right? So I think at the end of the day, being able to sort of show off, hey, these are the lines that we're coloring within, and we can show you that that's happening. The other part, and it's a sort of a byproduct of the silos that get created, is the alerts, right? I mean, we all know that alert fatigue, and this concept of signal to noise, and sort of how do I control that, right? If you're getting hit from 4 or 5 different places, or even 3 or 4 different places, right, it's hard to understand where the signal is, where the noise is, what should I be paying more attention to? And then obviously, as you move past that, even, every tool that you add adds cost and complexity, right? So how do I get the most out of those tools? Or, like, one of the CISOs that I was talking to one time, we were at the beginning of our discussion, and one of the things he said to me was, in a very proud tone, was, we have a very effective um, AppSec or DevSecOps program. And he did. He absolutely did. But one of the things I asked him was, I was like, how do you measure success? Right. So, again, how are you going about at a macro level, looking at this and saying, yes, these things are happening? And, I think, the moral of the story there was, like I told him, I was like, we're not here to ensure that you don't have any bad actors in your organization. 99.99% of these things are a result of just human error, the exposures to, sort of badness, right? And so, how do you keep an eye on all of that stuff, right? And that was a hard question to answer, right? For him, he could prove that he had all the tools in place, but it was hard to sort of prove out those things. And then I think the other two pieces to this are, again, overloaded developers. I think one of the things that we're taking, as we take an approach to, this sort of application security posture management space, is it has to be operationally transparent to the developers, right? Any tool that you're bringing in, I don't know if feeling eye rolling is a thing, but if it was, the minute you start to get some of those folks in a room and say, "Ah, you just got to change this, this, and this to your process," it's not well received, right? And so I think, for us, setting out to make security visibility here something that is very, very transparent operationally for those developers. And then obviously, the effectiveness, right? That goes back to the story I told earlier. How do I make sure that this thing is my security program is effective, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. And so I think, to summarize the challenges, that we're sort of attacking here, I think it's really about detect, prioritize, and remediate from a SecOps and DevOps perspective, right? Those are the things that people have told us they need help with. They want to make sure that we don't, create any additional burden in that sort of shift left model, right? And then we want to make sure that they can continue to leverage their existing tools. I don't want to show up and say, "Hey, I got this great thing." The only bad news is we got to rip out all the work you've done and start over again with these new workflows. We want to come to sort of where these consumers live, right? We want to make sure that they're using the tools they already have in place. And I think, from the developer perspective, it can be summarized really easy. Leave me alone, right? Like if you can provide me with some additional data, great, but I don't want to have to do anything different to get it. And I think that's another piece of this that's extremely important. And then at the executive management and the CISO levels, again, I think the challenge there that we've heard out in the marketplace is I'm writing the checks, I'm buying the tools, but I can't tell you. I'm going to assume effectiveness because I trust my people, but I don't have anything that shows me sort of how effective or what are the things that are trending downward from a security posture perspective or from a vulnerability perspective. And so that's sort of the challenges that we set out to sort of help some of our customers deal with. And then I think the last piece before we get into an understanding of features and functions is the architecture. And so I hate builds, so I'm gonna stop here for a second and I'll continue. But I think if you look at this, it starts along the bottom with our typical you know, developer or source code control, build control, artifact control, and then deployment control. Those are the four pillars for us around which we measure security. We take all the tools that someone's using, and we start to tap into those. We have a series of integrations. I think we're up to over 90 integrations, which is still a drop in the bucket, by the way. But we're sort of building these as we go. But those integrations include vulnerability scanning, code quality scanning, things like looking or scanning for secrets in code, all the way up to and including things like deployment platforms like Kubernetes, and using open source tooling to sort of help customers understand what's happening in those environments. So taking all that data, ultimately from that perspective, rolling it up into what we call the SDLC database, and then ultimately going down the path of applying the data that we've collected against a series of rules, policies, and best practices, right? And so that gives us what we need to not only be an inline continuous evaluation of security, but also the ability to go ahead and actually start to produce reporting and give complete transparency to that security piece. And again, I think the other pillar around this is the enforcement piece, which we'll talk about as well, which is really about, hey, this thing is moving so fast. And for most of the folks that we talk to, one of the things that came through loud and clear in our sort of the phase we went through in terms of sort of pre-building a product was, I need to make sure I've got a circuit breaker. I'm using GitOps. I've got releases that are just constantly going, and I want to make sure that from that perspective, there are certain things that I never want to see in production. And so I want to be able to make sure that by hook or by crook, none of that stuff makes it through. So we have this enforcement layer called the deployment firewall, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then ultimately on the compliance side, because we are essentially creating a system of record, we have what we call the delivery bill of materials, which is our sort of compliance reporting. And sort of what we use to say, hey, for every deployment that an organization does, we have a time-stamped and secured bill of materials that says here was the status of all the security checks that were done at the time this deployment happened. And it doesn't matter if it happens in dev, test, staging. Obviously, the most important one is it going to production. That's where the deployment firewall comes into play. But we are, capturing all that information to make sure that, you could go back to any deployment that was done and say this was the security posture of that software at the time that that deployment was done. So that's another piece of this that I think is important. Now, some of the benefits that we try and offer customers, and I think we're sort of going through this, is faster application releases. Obviously, again, we're reacting to that desire for velocity and scale, to make sure that sort of customers are able to continue to do that by adding a shim in the middle that collects all this data and acts as the security enforcer. We're trying to lower their cost of AppSec, and again, I think there's a number of different ways we can do that. But I think a lot of it is about squeezing more out of the tools they already have, or providing them with support. If you think about it, most of the open source options that are out there, one of the things they lack for things like vulnerability scanning is, sort of any sort of dashboarding or UI. So we can allow customers that freedom of choice without sacrificing that visibility. And then ultimately, when we think about automating compliance and global security visibility, these are all important, right? And again, I keep going back to or thinking back to that velocity chart, right? And making sure that we can ultimately put that shim in there and automate this collection. And a lot of this stuff will snap into focus when I actually show you this in action. And then obviously, that last piece, which is not an order of priority because this is an extremely important part, is that maintain some productivity from a shift left perspective. I don't want to add yet another task for the developer. I want them to actually be able to get value out of the tool without having to give anything up or do anything special or outside of their normal benefits. All right. So now that we've sort of defined the problem a little bit and given you guys a sense for what problems we're trying to solve, we could talk a little bit about the capabilities of the platform that we've built. And before I dive into that, I just want to pause real quick and make sure, Gopi, I didn't know if I've just said a lot of words and I didn't stop. So I want to make sure if there was anything you wanted to add, I wanted to give you the opportunity to do that.
No, Bob. I think you covered most of it.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
Excellent. He's probably going to kill me later for putting him on the spot. All right. So, guys, this is what. So, if you think about that first section around the definition of the problem, this is what we've come up with to sort of help with that problem, right? And so, I think when we think about what the capabilities are, and trust me, I'm not going to read all these words, but I think application lifecycle visibility in terms of end to end. So when you think about when we talk about measuring security, we're talking from source code all the way through to deployment, and you'll get to see that as I walk through the product. That security posture evaluation, again, not only am I evaluating the security posture at the application layer, but I'm also rolling this stuff up to the enterprise level as well, or the business unit level, or the application team level, where I'm allowing you to go ahead and evaluate the application security posture for those individual teams as well. Because again, I think if you think about this as not just, sort of a visibility, but also a management tool, a collaboration tool, I think, a lot of times when people, sort of make a decision to sort of invest in something like this, one of the things they're hoping for is help in understanding where they need to spend their time, right? There's no, sort of bad people out there. There's just people that, need to be better informed, or they need to spend more time with training, or make sure that they understand what's expected. We're going to help surface some of that. I think the policy enforcement piece is yet another piece of this where we'll talk about how flexible this is. And this is really where we give the customer that automated path to things like enforcement, but also allow you to tailor the evaluation that we make of the software to your needs. We're aware that not one size fits all, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then obviously the audit process, again, this is probably the least fun. But again, when I need to prove to an auditor, when I need to prove to my CISO, when I need to prove to anybody that's interested, or, God forbid, my customer, that I am actually following my SDLC, that document actually means something. That's really where that delivery bill of materials comes in. And then we also are now working in some features for incident response. So, I've got a background in open source and sort of understand from my days at Black Duck, sort of that 0-day vulnerability information and how there's a lot of exposure for organizations as they bring in open source. So one of the things we're starting to do is helping you discover, as an example, if there's a 0-day vulnerability, the very first thing you want to do is figure out, well, where am I exposed? And so ultimately, once that's gone through the numbering the numbering process, we give you the ability to search for that vulnerability throughout your entire enterprise, and we expose to you sort of where those bodies are buried, so that you know sort of how to create a remediation plan. So that's another piece of this. And just as a future, guys, one of the other things that we're going to really get heavy into as we look to move into the second half of the year is open source risk management, right? So I've been talking to Gopi quite a bit about, how do we expose to our customers whether or not the open source that's being brought in, how risky is it? Everything from the license that it's leveraging or it's being used under, to how viable is the project, to what is the project's mean time to repair for things like vulnerabilities, how prone are they to vulnerabilities? So I think a lot of that stuff starts to fall under the heading of software supply chain and ultimately helping you secure that. So we're sort of making traveling down that path as well. Now, I think the SDLC tracking, I think for us, again, I think I mentioned earlier, we break it up into, sort of 4 pillars. There's, how is your source code management? What does that look like? So we'll tap into GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab and make an assessment of, sort of your source code management. And if you're using, some of the advanced security features from, say, like GitHub, we'll track the fact that that's happening, right? We'll acknowledge the fact that that's happening in those repositories, and then ultimately make sure that those standards are being met from source code, the source code scenario, and also bringing in things like your static code analysis test results to make sure that those are documented. And most people will say, hey, I'm not going to pass CI if I fail static code analysis. That's great, and that's the way it should be. But we also want to make sure we have a record of that thing passing or not passing in the event that for some reason you don't have it blocking there. We're going to look at your build system, right? We're going to look at the build tools you're using. Like, I'm not going to shock anyone here by saying we put a lot of focus on Jenkins, but things like are the webhooks secure that you're using? Are you using secure plugins? Are the build approvers the correct people? And then ultimately start tracking artifact provenance as well as you move through the cycle. And then obviously the other piece of this is, how's your repo being managed, your artifact repo? We're going to do things like scan artifacts as they leave the build system. We're going to track whether it be the digital signature or the SHA there to make sure, again, image provenance is met. And then we've also got the ability to do continuous scanning of these artifacts once they're deposited. Now, when I say we have the ability, we can use either the open source tools that we ship with, or if you already have a scanning tool like a Sneak or some other tool out there, we integrate with that and ultimately can ingest those results as well. And then lastly, we're obviously going to take a look at the deployment environment, right? So here we're going to scan infrastructures, code files, and manifests, and better understand sort of how the software is going to be deployed and what environmental changes are being made out in front of the software deployment, and compare that against things like sys benchmarks, right? And then formulate some scoring for you as we look across all of these things. And I think right now we're up to close to 300 different checks that we're doing based on the data that's coming in. and it's growing at a pretty rapid rate because customers now are also telling us, hey, you're missing this, so we go ahead and fill those gaps. The other thing we're doing too is for every policy that we have or every rule, we also tag it with if somebody's trying to develop against a security framework like NIST or FedRAMP or one of the others, we're going ahead and actually tagging those rules so that you can kind of get a sense. And our goal is to start publishing scorecards like the OAuth CI/CD top 10. We're going to publish a scorecard against that based on some of the rules that we're enforcing that are associated with that framework as well. Again, I think the other piece of this, guys, is really about helping you understand real-time risk assessment, right? Like, so, we don't, stop scanning, or we're not going to stop at, some point. We've actually, the way we've constructed this, we don't need to rely on a deployment event per se to continue to scan, right? So we're always going to report on, especially the dynamic parts of security, the parts that change. The CVE landscape or the vulnerability landscape is a great example of that, right? Where, just because you've done your build and you've got your artifact and it's sort of pre-deploy or post-deploy, you might freeze that in time, but the world doesn't, right? And so any of those open source projects that you used as part of building that image, that landscape, the vulnerabilities that are associated with that are extremely dynamic. We're helping customers keep up with that from a reporting perspective to give you that real-time risk assessment. And then, I think the other part of this that you'll see during the demo too is that enforcement piece. Right now, full disclosure, we still have some customers that this is something new to them, right? Like they're a little nervous about introducing something that could potentially block a deployment that late in the process. However, they do recognize the fact that they do need some sort of circuit breaker in order to comfortably, go about, sort of operating at any sort of velocity or scale. And I'll show you as we walk through the product where, as a customer or as a user, you could define the specific incidents that would warrant this. Or you could say, you know what, I just want to run it in audit mode. I just want to run it in, sort of observe mode for a while before I sort of get into any sort of blocking. Other companies, depending on, sort of how they're regulated, say, hey, I want to make sure that there are no critical CVEs in anything that goes into my production environment. And of course, that being dynamic, making sure that that check's done just before the deployment is of real value to them. So this is there in terms of that enforcement piece. And of course, again, I think, when we talked earlier about, some of the challenges around compliance, we sort of coined this term delivery bill of materials. And, it seemed fitting at the time, and it still does, because I think one of the things that we're doing here is we're telling you, here are all the things that happened to this code as it went through the process. Here are all the checks that were done. Here's the pass fail for all of these tests. And here are the details, right? And so obviously, as you go through that process and want to create a system of record, you want something like this, right? That is, sort of time stamped and ultimately, again, can prove that you've done what you say you're going to do when you set out to craft your SDLC. And ultimately are meeting all those security pieces. Now, the fun part. Let me actually show you what we've built, just to sort of give you a sense for our ability to sort of put our money where our mouth is, right? So what I'm going to do here is stop sharing and then start sharing again so I can get the right window. All right. So hopefully, we'll be able to tie a lot of this stuff back so you can sort of see where we are in our journey.
Can you make it a little bit bigger, Bob? Is it possible to scroll in a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. That's
it's a lot of information, but I can't quite see it. A
little better?
Yeah, that's looking good.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, and I this is what I get when you wear a World War II binoculars for glasses. So, um, so guys, I think as we go through this, I want you to keep in mind all the things we talked about earlier and all the problems that we're trying to solve. And I think, what you're looking at here is sort of, our obligatory sort of opening dashboard, right? So, I think the idea behind this again is to distill all the data that our customers are collecting through all the tools that they're using and start to formulate a very opinionated view of the security of that application. Now, the reason we put this dashboard together is, one of the first things you need to do is need to know you're not just, saying, hey, I got 15 minutes to kill. Let me go cruise a couple of dashboards. You're here for a reason, right? You want to see sort of where should I be paying attention? And so we give you that view across dev, across staging. If I want to change the scope or the lens, I can also look at production and ultimately see sort of what's what and sort of what's in the pipeline, what's coming, and what is its current security risk or what is its current security posture, right? And so you get that view of that. And again, I think the other piece of this is what we talked about earlier. We're measuring all this stuff across source code management, build management, artifact management, and deployment management. And so you can see here as well the different tools that we're integrated with for any one of these given applications, right? And we've got, again, close to 90, maybe a little over 90 in different integrations, and it's growing constantly as we sort of work with more customers. Now, as you get down this path, the next thing you want to do is you want to say, well, let's pick one of these applications and let's take a closer look, right? So again, here, I set the stage and then I'm looking at what's currently deployed in the dev environment. I can sort of see where the issues are, right? So I've got some source code control issues. I've got, some issues with the way artifacts are being managed. And, quite frankly, you're not going to be too surprised that, the deployment environment maybe isn't as robust given that it is dev. But nonetheless, you want to be aware of what's happening there. And then obviously we are application aware. So one of the first things we're doing is going out and discovering applications and then ultimately understanding the application makeup. So you can see here, this app is made up of these services, right? So I've got a sense for that. And then I'm giving you the risk status on a service by service basis. Now, we'll come back to this in just a minute, but one of the things I want to talk about before we get too deep into this is sort of how did we get here? How did we get to these numbers? Like, how did we get to, 80 security alerts, right? And so for that, I want to talk a little bit about, sort of how we measure the data that we pull in, right? So I think, again, I mentioned earlier, we're approaching some 300 odd sort of rules. And again, I think this here is one of those things. If you think about what we're doing, we've got data coming in on one side and we're comparing it against rules and best practices on the other. Now, what's important here are really two things. One, this rule set doesn't define the entire product. We give the customer the ability to create their own rule set. We'll help them do that. Ultimately, if there's rules that they want to see that we're missing, we're flexible enough to make sure we can help them create those rules. The other part of this is we also understand, and we understood from the very beginning, that one size doesn't fit all, right? So just because a best practice says something doesn't mean that I haven't already accounted for it somewhere down the road, right? So I don't already have a compensating control. And if one of the things we learned early on was if you don't give a company this level of flexibility, they can very quickly end up with a tool that's generating more noise than it is signal. So we allow our customers at the administrative level to decide on the severity of any given rule. And then more importantly, we give them the ability to decide what action the product is going to take in the event that there's a violation of that rule. So I can go ahead and cherry pick the things that I want to make sure fall into the prevent bucket versus the things that are just going to generate alerts, right? And we do this across the build environment, the artifact set of rules that are going to include like artifact provenance, and then in the deploy environment, where we're looking at things like sys benchmarks and other configuration pieces that we can glean based on some of the tooling that we're using under the covers to assess some of these things. And whether it be Kubernetes or other deployment environments, we have the ability to sort of look at those things and make an assessment. So that's how we get to this, which is data mapped against rules, and then ultimately say, okay, these things are out of compliance versus these things are in compliance. And then obviously we're also using things like the data we get from your vulnerability scanner, or let's say you're just using our default, which is Trivy. We'll do those scans for you as well. But whatever source of that data, we're going to go ahead and ultimately make that assessment in terms of things like vulnerabilities and general security alerts. Now, as we move on through this process, one of the things that I like to point out, and let me just go back here real quick. I mentioned earlier, this concept of trying to make life easier on the developers. So one of the things that we built into the product is something that we're calling Smart Diff. I think, we're probably going to end up, changing the name a little bit, because really what it is a deployment simulation. So as a developer, I could come in here and say, hey, I've got code sitting in dev, and I know I've got code sitting in production. What would happen if from a security perspective, what would happen if I attempted to promote what's currently in dev into production? And as you can see here, what we're generating for the developer is essentially a punch list of security violations that they would need to remediate, right? Or they should look at remediating. That includes things like new vulnerabilities, right? Like I could see what new vulnerabilities I'd be introducing, right? So, I think as a nod to the developer, we want to make sure that, we give them that ability to say, hey, how do I isolate the things from a security perspective that I know I'm going to need to work on or fix? And so that was this sort of concept of a pre-flight check. Now, the delivery bill of materials is, again, something that I think, from a compliance perspective, we're obviously grabbing we understand the software composition, so we're bringing in the SBOM, so we understand that. And then as you look at across this here, in this case here, I'm looking at a specific service, not just the application as a whole. I can see where the problems are, right? So here I've got a couple of problems with Git posture, right? And some things that have failed here. I've got some issues with, if I were to continue to scroll down, checks around, I should say, things like secret scanning and all the things that are being done. Like here we did a secret scan with Trivy and everything passed, right? So I can sort of see what passed, what failed. But this also, because it's a permanent record and it's time stamped, this is, sort of what happened when this was deployed to dev. This was what the current posture was. And I get into that level of detail that's going to allow me to go ahead and actually, if I were to do this with one of my production deployments, so if I were to look at this from that perspective, you're going to see everything's green, right? So here I can prove that, the things that I passed were non-blocking issues. The things that I ran into were non-blocking issues. And so I can see the security posture and the DBOM from when this was deployed to production as well. So again, this is giving me that auditability, and it's automated because I'm collecting the data and just assimilating it and ultimately telling you this was the status of your application when it was deployed. We're also doing a more graphical view of this. So this here is something that, people can use, and ultimately export. We also have a more graphical view of this where I can ultimately go ahead and see, hey, what were the situations for each one of the tests that were run against the various pieces of infrastructure that I'm looking at or the code that I'm looking at. I can very quickly get to that here. And I can switch context between this and build and then artifact as well. So that makes it nice and simple. The other piece of this that I know I've mentioned a handful of times is our enforcement layer. So anytime I were to mark one of these things as prevent, what will happen is the deployment firewall at the time of the deployment to production is actually going to go back and say, are there any prevent violations that would cause me to want to block this deployment? And if there aren't any, it goes ahead and proceeds. If there are, what will happen is it will actually block the deployment. It will send out the appropriate notifications. And then ultimately you'll be brought back to this, which allows you to very quickly get to, hey, here are the things that were marked as blocks. So here are the things that you need to deal with in order to get this deployment to go through. And so again, we're surfacing those things very, very quickly. And then I think the rest of this is really about things like remediation. So, the other piece of this is, we want to make sure that we're able to help you remediate these problems as you see them. So here, I've got the ability to create a JIRA ticket. I can ultimately apply for an exception here where, if a developer says, hey, the way this software is deployed, I don't really have to worry about this yet. It's going to take me 30 days to fix this. I can apply for an exception. Or, to do the obligatory, sort of AI piece, I can ask ChatGPT what I should do, right? And, I think, ultimately we're providing where the fixed version is, a description of the problem, and ultimately sort of trying to provide some guidance to the developer. Now, we're going to be doing more with this as time goes on. Things like helping them deal with dependencies and help them look for alternative libraries if for some reason fixing this is really an option for them. And so that's sort of that remediation piece. And then, as we look at this and go down the path of, sort of roll-ups, we're also looking at, if I were to look at, all of these, I could start to get into trending, right? So this is where we get down to, hey, I've invested a lot here. How do I know that my organization is moving in the right direction? And I think for us, it's really about being able to show you the trending for the security alerts. So these are all the alerts, and I can do searches, or I can isolate an image or a stage or a tag, right? So I can see sort of this. But this is sort of that enterprise view where a CISO might come in and say, well, I think we're sort of flatlining here. We need to sort of figure out how to start to drive some of these numbers down. We do the same thing with vulnerabilities, right? Again, rolling this stuff up so that you can get ultimately a view of, sort of what direction you're heading in, right? And then if you want to isolate it to either an application or an environment, or, if you want to isolate it to a team, if I had multiple teams here, I could ultimately view the data through a team lens as well to ultimately help you at sort of that higher level. And then the last piece I think is important is I talked a little bit about, sort of incident response, right? And I think, again, having been part of these, sort of war rooms in the past, whenever we have a CVE that gets published, that's like, oh, wow, this is a 0 day. And so no matter what version of this open source project you're using, your chances are you're affected by this. Because we have all the data, we know where everything is deployed, we know what CVEs impact what applications, we can very quickly isolate and say, okay, this CVE impacts these applications. And then as I move down the path, I can say, oh, now this is the specific service within that application that's impacted. So I can very quickly start to build a remediation strategy and prioritize based on, again, sort of what's in production versus what's in dev, and ultimately get through that. So this is just another way we're leveraging the data that we have available to us to help our customers, more effectively manage risk and security at the application layer. So guys, I'm going to stop there and do two things. First off, this was all the material I had. Let me go back to, and I'm going to stop sharing because it's going to make me change windows again. So let me get back to the right window. And I want to go ahead and open it up for questions. And also, obviously, from that perspective, Gopi, again, not to put you on the spot, but anything you think I have forgotten or was wrong about, I want you to please feel free to comment on that as well.
No, it's not that it's forgotten, but the idea here is using this product to get a application security posture from code to production without having to change your process as it is for your SDLC. So as you see, most of the integrations that we have For example, we have integrations with Argo, Spinnaker, Jenkins, Flux. Essentially, if you have one of those delivery tools, we can get the data from them on your delivery process itself, and then get the security scans at different things, secret scanning or vulnerability scan, and give you the posture for it, including the deployment environment. So that's the idea there. Without having to disrupt your process, provide visibility and collaboration between the security teams and the developers, and make it a little bit easier to resolve issues. But there's also this question someone was asking if the tool itself is certified. Typically, when we go to organizations, they ask for process certifications and something like a PCI kind of a compliance, right? But the tool itself is not yet certified for on-premises. Bob, do you have a sense of what that looks like?
Yeah, so I think, by the way, I'm looking at the chat now. I think the original question was about, do we offer certifications for individuals, right? And I think the answer is not yet. The key word there being yet, right? I think right now, one of the things we want to do is we want to work through, getting the foundation built, and then ultimately start to offer programs around this, right? So that as our hope is that we are wildly successful and that people can take the skills that they've learned leveraging our tool, and as they move from job to job, sort of bring that in and be certified, from a security perspective in terms of interpreting and leveraging this tool to manage an organization's end-to-end application security. So I think the operative there is not yet, but I think we're thinking about that. The other thing, guys, that we are also thinking about is things like working within frameworks like Salsa and other sort of certification frameworks for software, and then ultimately allowing customers to measure that going forward. So I think I think that's also extremely important. And then the other piece of this, and I think, Gopi, this goes to what you were getting at, is we're also looking to help our customers measure. It's one of those things when you think about things like NIST and some of the other security frameworks. OWASP is one of my favorites. It's always hard to sort of gauge sort of where you are, right? So we are, I guess, codifying the checks that go into those things and helping our customers assess, hey, based on the 85% test coverage we can get from, the OpsMX product, we're compliant with the OWASP CI/CD top 10, or one of the other frameworks that's out there. And for us, it's just a continuation to sort of build on top of that. So hopefully that was helpful, guys.
All right. For those that might have questions, the way this platform works, the mics and cameras aren't on, but you can put your questions in the chat. I'll read them out loud for Bob and Gopi. Otherwise, I do have some of my own questions. Maybe a statement, just to make sure I understand the platform first. It looks like that OpsMX is able to capture data and metadata about my software and my software delivery lifecycle from my build tools, from my source code repository, from my cloud environment, get all the metadata into one place, and with the policy engine and other tools on the back end, be able to kind of send back, make decisions by having all that data. That's normally you have to look at all these different places, but by bringing it all together, now I can have a holistic view of what's there. Am I putting it in a 30-second package correctly? Am I understanding it?
Yeah, you are. But are you on mute?
There we go. Yes. Sorry about that. I have some dogs in the background who were violently agreeing with you as well, and I didn't think people needed to hear. So, but the answer there is yes. I think the idea behind this, guys, is, just as you said, Jim, really bringing all that data together into one platform, being able to analyze it, be able to provide our customers with an end-to-end assessment of the security of that sort of life cycle, and then sprinkle some enforcement and compliance on top of that, right? And I think that's really where the value is. And I think, again, one of the other things I like to tell people is we also give our customers freedom of choice, right? So, and I think what I mean by that is when you look at some of the DevOps platforms that are out there, and by the way, this is not a dig at any of them because they all do a very good job. Some of them I used to work for, the folks over at Synopsys, right, where they've added Black Duck to their stack and Coverity and all these other things, and then they'll come along and say, hey, we've got this wonderful, sort of visibility platform called Polaris. What they're doing is they're essentially locking you in, right? And so some customers don't like that level of vendor lock-in, so they want to continue to use the tools. And if you go back to one of my slides, you're also taking some of the freedom of choice away from your developers in terms of tools. So we want to give our customers that freedom of choice. No matter what you choose, we're going to give you that end-to-end visibility. So Jim, I think you got it spot on, and hopefully I wanted to sprinkle in a little bit of extra there just to round that out.
Yeah, no, that's great. We have a question from the chat from Sam McGraw. Any comments on OpsMX and capturing open source code certification? Sam, do you have any more feedback? Maybe you guys understand the question. I'm not quite grabbing it, but maybe you guys have an idea of the open source certification.
Yeah,
Sam
and I understand where
I
understand where Sam's coming from. So, and he'll tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think there's two pieces that we're looking at here, right? Is like, are some of the open source projects, complying with some of the certification frameworks that are out there, like Salsa or other, scenarios, and then obviously the other piece that we're actually in the process of looking at that now. I think one of the things we want to do is make sure that we do that correctly and that we capture that information correctly. The other piece is just, not just the certification piece, but also coming up with an algorithm that'll also help us with non-certified open source projects, right? So open source projects that are just haven't chosen to comply with some of those things, and ultimately make a risk assessment of those as well. So looking at what is it licensed under? How many forks? How many stars? How many contributions? How many unique contributors? What's the viability of the open source? And then, what's their mean time to repair for security problems? Things like that. The minute we can start to give our customers a window into that, it'll also make managing open source much easier. So, Sam, hopefully that answered your question.
He says yes, so that's great. One follow-up question for me, it's not on the certification of the open source, but some of that legal departments maybe you want to look at but don't have a good way to do it is open source software compliance. If you have all these different kinds of licenses, they may have a nice document that says, yes, we can use these. No, we never want to use these because it puts our intellectual property at risk. Is that data available in OpsMX? And if not, is it something, I don't know, just an idea.
It's going to be. It's actually going to be, right? So yeah. So this idea of monitoring what might be quote unquote approved open source, right? So I think not only do we want to give those customers that are a little bit more freewheeling a sense for the risk that they're taking on with the projects that their developers are choosing, but for the ones that have slightly stricter legal departments where they say, hey, here are the approved open source, right? Or maybe even here are the approved licenses that you can use. So anything that's a copy left type of is a no bueno. But things that are MIT or Apache 2 rather, are fine. So that's all part of our vision, right? So I think in Q3 we're going to look to roll out that open source risk management that'll include things like, hey, let's make sure our customers don't become the victim of things like typo squatting, or the open source projects that they are using are robust enough or are viable that, if you use a project that's abandoned, you essentially become the owner of that code, right? Because the minute something goes wrong, there's no one there to fix it, right? So suddenly all the leverage of open source sort of just drifts away, right? So we want to make sure that our customers have that sense as well. And I think so. Hopefully, Jim, that answers your question. But I think the short answer is yes, it's coming.
So the idea here is also being able to collect this data from the open source and have it available for customized policies. So the policy engine that we currently have is based on the Open Policy Agent. So you can use some kind of a chat GPT to generate policies with English text, right? That's one of the things that we experimented with and works reasonably well. So they can come up with these policies saying, we require you to use these sources only, or they require you to use only these licenses. And because now we have the data with it, they can apply these policies. So it becomes fairly customizable for a given enterprise to apply those kind of policies once we have the data.
Yep.
Question from Paulo in the chat, and this is along the theme of giving developers feedback, kind of where they need it. Maybe it's feedback that they could have straight in their code editor, maybe in VS Code or JetBrains. Any kind of alerts that you have right now or have been thinking about to provide developers early on in their development process?
So this is an interesting one. We've heard this a couple times, and I think right now we're in the process of figuring out sort of where we would fit in a plugin like that, right? So right now, if you were to use Coverity or you were to use SemGrep or one of these others, they'll typically have a plugin that'll help warn you if you're making mistakes or writing insecure code. The static code analysis tools typically will do a lot of that, right? And so I think for us, what we want to figure out is if that's the case and developers using a static code analysis tool to do that stuff, then what would a plugin like ours look like? And I think we're focusing in on that deployment pre-flight check, right? So how do we maybe help them within the IDE say, hey, this thing here is introducing a vulnerability that isn't in the current production environment or whatnot. So I think this concept of an editor extension is appealing to us. We just want to make sure that we fit in the right spot, right? So that's sort of where we're at today. And I think you'll see something like that from us maybe in the second half of the year.
All right. I have a question on the data sources, not necessarily data sources, but on the topic of data sources where we can see things flowing through the pipeline. Most companies already have stuff that's already in production, so that data wasn't captured at that time. Is there, and maybe it didn't catch it, but what's already in production, is there tie-ins to systems like Qualys or that would do disk scans or plugins into the APIs of the cloud vendor themselves to give a list of assets that are out there? Are those types of things there to know like what's out there in real life? Maybe somebody's changed something by hand later that didn't flow through the pipeline. Can you give us an idea of what you guys have there?
Yeah. So for that, in the hyper short term, right now we're doing things like application discovery. So we'll go out to say like a Kubernetes cluster, and we've got something called kube detect that'll go out and look at what is the configuration and what applications are currently deployed, and then map those back to if they were integrated with the artifact repository, giving us the ability to scan sort of what's in the artifact repository, and then ultimately what we're hoping to do in the sort of short to medium term is we've already got an integration with Kubescape, but integration with some other tooling that'll help us detect any drift. And then, lastly, obviously one of the things we want to do is we want to make sure that we're plugged in with our cloud security posture provider friends, right? So folks like Wiz and other tools that are out there that might be doing continuous scanning of running pods or running artifacts, right? That we can ultimately fetch that information from as well. But I think those are the things that are, I think, important to us in terms of bootstrapping, installing a system like this, getting as much data as we can, and then ultimately making that security assessment from there. Let me stop there though, and Gopi, any gaps you want to fill in there? Or did I get all that?
Yeah, you captured that. So we consider discovery and correlation as one of the key aspects of the product. When we are looking at scale with multiple groups that are using tools that are delivering, one of the problems that they generally face for the collaboration is the ability to discover and then know the posture. So we put a lot of effort in the discovery part. So that's something that we are continuing to improve from our side. That will include integration with things like Wiz.
All right, one more technical question. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, and then after that, I'll ask you guys a question that I ask all our speakers. It's non-technical.
Sure.
But just on software supply chain, there was the recent XZ backdoor that was brewing, and it would have been a 0 day. I guess on certain branches it was of Linux it was a 0 day. But any thoughts on that XZ compression tool where basically somebody over multiple years kind of took over the project and started adding backdoors that weren't discovered until after it made it into production? Do you guys see yourself playing in that space of like early discovery, or you're going to be at 0 day just to be able to tell you where everything is at?
So what's interesting to me, and again, I'll also defer to Gopi on some of this, but I think at the present time, I think our role is going to be discover and help you remediate, right? In terms of where are those bodies buried when that's been announced, right? And I think that's probably going to be the case for a lot of folks in our space where they are just now coming to fruition and they don't have the research arms that a company like Sneak might have, right? So Sneak's out there doing, I competed with them for a long time, especially in their early days, and they're very, very effective, right, in terms of their research. Black Duck has essentially, or Synopsys has essentially done the same thing, where they've built out research arms. I think for us, in the short term anyway, we'll continue to play our role, which is to sort of let you know what the security posture is and leave the discovery part to the folks that have that level of expertise. But that's not to say that we won't eventually build that out, right? I think depending on sort of where we end up going and where the market takes us, I could very well see us building out sort of that type of arm where we start to look at these things early. By the way, this person went through a lot of trouble to hide in plain sight. My tip of the cap, it's one of those things where they did something that was really hard, and hiding in plain sight like that. But I think, I don't know, Gopi, what you think, but that was just my take.
Yeah, that's definitely a hard one. It's more like an insider attack, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be some of these additional AI tools that will look for certain kind of patterns for those things. So we probably won't be there for some time, but that was an interesting attack. I see one of the questions Lynn had here is also about the PII information. So we do support secret scanning to some extent with Git repositories and the binaries. But we are also now looking at using the AI tools to do the log analysis as well, particularly for the Jenkins build logs or at the deployment time logs to see, just pass them through and identify if there is any PII or secrets within those logs. Right? So that is something that definitely we have partially, but that is a big piece for us going forward.
Yeah, thanks for catching that when I scrolled past that question. So thanks, Gopi. All right, final question. It's non-technical. It's in case we have any younger people earlier in their career, which I think we do have tonight. So it's a kind of a career advice question. So Gopi and Bob, you guys are seasoned tech professionals. seasoned in life as well. If you could go back in time and talk to your 20-year-old self, is there any particular, life skills or career skills, any kind of guidance that you would give a younger person? Bob, I don't know if you want to go first, or Gopi, if you guys want to play rock paper scissors, but
I'll jump in, and that just gives you a sense for how many mistakes I've made in my career. I have a whole cornucopia of things, but to sum it up, guys, I think this business and sort of technology in general, and as we all choose to sort of get into this, right? You've really got to find that niche around, sort of in that environment. When I say environment, whether you're a startup guy or you're a large company person, there's no, to me anyway, I always thought, hey, it's cool to go work for a startup. And so, I settled in on that, and I got lucky in that I stayed with that. So find a lane that sort of makes you happy, right? And I know it sounds cliche, but my father used to say, if you enjoy what you do, you never work a day in your life, right? So find that niche that makes you happy, and whether it be, because in our business there are so many roles you can play. You can be customer facing, you can be a product guy, you can be, someone like Gopi, who's a thought leader and, sort of a developer and somebody that can create, right? I'm overhead, right? But I like to think that over 20 years, I've now become somebody that is capable of adding value. But pick a lane that you really enjoy and stick with it, right? In this business. Don't feel pressure to sort of jump around. Pick that lane and stick with it, and really sort of become a master of your craft. And if you can do that, you never have to worry because you enjoy every day getting up and going to work. So that's my take. I don't know how helpful it was, but hopefully that was helpful. And Gopi, I'm sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for Gopi to give his advice.
No. So the business we are in, there are no dearth of problems that are exciting. Right? There is so many different things going on. Since 90s, it's been pretty exciting ride. So like Bob said, you need to pick what you like. Some people love dealing with the customers. Some people like to just stay in their seat and just solve problems. So if you figure out what that is and just be in that zone where you like it, you'll be successful, whether it's a startup or a large company.
That's great. Thanks, Gopi. Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate you guys taking your time to join us today. Thank you for everybody for joining. We'll round of applause. We had some great presentation messages in the chat.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Walker.
So what we'll do now, we'll take a little bit of a break. If you'd like to stick around, and that's even for you, Bob and Gopi, I know you guys are busy. So if you can stick around, it's not a big deal. We'll take a 5-minute break. We'll make everybody a presenter when we come back. So we can turn on our mics and our video. We can I'll have an icebreaker question. I'll probably have to ask ChatGPT or Gemini for a new one. Otherwise, I'll end up talking about your favorite food, which is, for me, it's barbecue. So we'll do a little virtual networking if you can stick around. If you joined late and didn't get to see all the presentation, recording should be up by Monday, usually sooner, and you'll be able to catch everything that Bob and Gopi were talking about. All right. Yes. So I'm going to, Bob, if you stop sharing your screen, I'll be able to share mine. I'll put up a little countdown timer. And thanks once again. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, I'll say, Jim, thank you. I want to thank everyone that came tonight. And by the way, I noticed that you guys will be entertaining our friends over at Ox in a few weeks. You're going to hear some very similar messaging from them. They're a great company. I'm actually I've been a friend of their chief marketing officer for 20 years. So you're in for a treat when you see their presentation as well. So enjoy it.
Yep.
Cool.
Great. Thank you.